Welcome to the channel Final Slaves. Today's story is about John Mercer, a black boy in 1877, known for his blue eyes, who was believed to be dead and then came back from the dead in a case so impossible, bizarre, and inexplicable that it left an entire community in fear and disbelief. This is a difficult and intense story. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The winter of 1877 descended upon Charleston, South Carolina, with an unusual ferocity that old-timers claimed they hadn't witnessed in 4 decades. The Ashley River froze along its edges for the first time in living memory, and frost crept across the cobblestones of the old city like ghostly fingers reaching up from a forgotten past. But it wasn't the cold that would make this winter unforgettable. It was what emerged from the darkness on a frigid February night that would shake the foundations of everything the people of Charleston thought they understood about life, death, and the boundaries between them. On the evening of February 14th, a boy walked through the iron gates of St. Michael's Cemetery just as the church bells struck midnight. His bare feet left no prints in the thin layer of snow that had fallen earlier that day. His clothes, tattered remnants of what had once been a simple cotton shirt and trousers, hung from his thin frame like grave shrouds. But it was his eyes that would haunt those who saw him first. Brilliant blue, luminous in the moonlight, set in a face as dark as polished mahogany. In an era where such a combination was rare enough to draw stares, these eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light that defied natural explanation. The night watchman, Silas Porter, a grizzled Confederate veteran who had seen horrors enough during the war to steel his nerves against most disturbances, dropped his lantern when he saw the ball. The glass shattered on the frozen ground, all spreading in dark rivulets that reflected the moon like spilled mercury. Silas would later tell anyone who would listen that he had stared into the face of the impossible that night, a child he had helped bury with his own hands 3 weeks prior. The boy's name was John Mercer, and according to every official record, every witness, and every shred of physical evidence, he had died on January 22, 1877, at approximately 4 in the afternoon. To understand the impossibility of what happened that February night, we must first journey back 6 years earlier to the autumn of 1871, when John Mercer's story truly began, not with his death, but with his arrival into a world that had barely begun to heal from the wounds of war. John had been born in the turbulent spring of 1865, just as General Sherman's army was carving its way through the Carolinas and the Confederacy was breathing its last tortured breaths. His mother, Sarah Mercer, was a woman whose past remained shrouded in deliberate silence. She had appeared in Charleston in the summer of 1864, her belly already swollen with child, claiming to be a freed woman from Savannah whose papers had been lost in a fire. In those chaotic final months of the war, with refugees streaming into the city from all directions, no one had questioned her story too closely. What drew attention and whispered speculation was the child she eventually bore. When John emerged into the world on a humid April morning, the midwife, an elderly woman named Esther Williams, who had delivered half the black children in Charleston over 4 decades, had gasped audibly. The infant's skin was dark, unmistakably African in heritage, but his eyes, when they finally opened 3 days after birth, were the color of a clear summer sky. In the strictly segregated society of Reconstruction-era Charleston, such anomalies carried dangerous weight. Eyes that blue suggested white ancestry, and white ancestry suggested stories that polite society preferred to leave unspoken. But Sarah Mercer offered no explanations. She worked as a washerwoman, taking in laundry from the better homes in the city, keeping her head down and her son close. They lived in a small wooden house on Archdale Street, in the heart of the neighborhood that had become home to Charleston's growing community of formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives in Freedom's uncertain dawn. John grew up as a quiet, observant child. His unusual eyes made him a target for both curiosity and cruelty from other children, but he learned early to deflect attention with a gentle demeanor and quick smile. He attended the school established by the Freedmen's Bureau, where a northern teacher named Miss Catherine would recognize in him an uncommonly sharp mind. By the age of 6, John could read better than children twice his age. By 7, he was helping Miss Wood teach the younger students their letters. But it was his relationship with his mother that defined those early years. Sarah Mercer loved her son with a fierce, almost desperate intensity that everyone in their neighborhood recognized. She worked brutal hours to keep them fed and clothed, her hands becoming raw and cracked from endless days in scalding wash water. On Sunday evenings, when the week's labor was done, she would sit with John on the small porch of their house and tell him stories, not fairy tales, but something stranger. She spoke of a place she called the threshold, a space between waking and sleeping, between living and dying, where the rules that governed ordinary existence grew thin and flexible. The world ain't all what you can see and touch, John, she would tell him, her voice taking on a distant quality as twilight deepened around them. There is doors everywhere, if you know how to look for them. Doors that open onto places that don't follow the laws folks think can't be broken. Young John would listen, not fully understanding, but sensing that his mother was sharing something important, something she needed him to know. She would touch his face gently, her work-roughened fingers tracing the outline of his cheekbones, and add, "You got a foot in both worlds, child. Them eyes of yours, they see more than most. Do remember that when the time comes." The time came in the fall of 1871, when John was 6 years old. It started with dreams, vivid, unsettling visions that would jolt him awake in the dead of night, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dreamed of a man he had never seen before, tall, with pale skin and eyes the same impossible blue as his own. In the dreams, this man would stand at the foot of John's bed, not speaking, just watching with an expression of profound sadness. Sometimes he would reach out a hand as if offering to pull John toward him, toward something John couldn't quite see in the shadows behind the figure. Sarah noticed the change in her son immediately. Yon began to wake screaming, thrashing against sheets soaked with sweat. He started walking in his sleep. And twice, Sarah found him standing in the small cemetery behind the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, staring at the headstones with those luminous blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. The third time it happened, she didn't bring him home right away. Instead, she sat with him among the graves as dawn broke over Charleston, and she finally told him a truth she had kept locked away for 6 years. "The man in your dreams," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the morning birdsong. "His name was Thomas Whitmore. It was your father, John." The boy turned those startling blue eyes toward her, and Sarah felt her heart crack open. "He was a good man," she continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken inside her. "Better than most white men I ever knew. He didn't see me as property or something less than human. He saw me, really saw me. We loved each other, John, even though the world said we had no right to such feelings. Even though his family would have killed us both if they'd known." She explained that Thomas Whitmore had been the youngest son of a prominent Charleston family, a man tormented by the contradictions of a society built on slavery. He had secretly helped enslaved people escape via the Underground Railroad, using his position and privilege to undermine the very system that had made his family wealthy. Sarah had met him when she was still enslaved on a plantation outside Savannah, and he had helped her escape in the summer of 1864. "He was going to meet me here in Charleston after the war," Sarah said, tears now streaming down her face. "We were going to start over somewhere up north, where maybe we could be a real family. But he never came. He waited for months, and then I heard they'd been killed. His own brother found out what they'd been doing. Found out about me, about you growing inside me. They said it was a hunting accident. But I know better. They murdered him, John. They murdered your father to protect their precious family name." Yon sat in silence, processing this revelation. Finally, he asked the question that had been growing in his mind. "Why is he in my dreams now, Mama? Why is he calling to me?" Sarah had no answer, at least not one that made sense in the rational world. But in the weeks that followed, the dreams intensified. Yon began to complain of feeling pulled, as if invisible hands were tugging at him, trying to drag him somewhere he couldn't name. He grew pale and thin despite Sarah's efforts to keep him fed. Dark circles appeared under those remarkable blue eyes. Desperate, Sarah sought help from everyone she could think of. She took John to the doctor who served the black community, a northern physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had come south with the occupying Union forces and stayed after the war. Dr. Webb could find nothing physically wrong with the boy, though he noted the child's disturbing weight loss and suggested a tonic to help him sleep. The tonic didn't help. If anything, the dreams grew worse. Sarah then turned to the community's spiritual leaders. She brought John to see Reverend Morris of the Emmanuel AME Church, a powerful speaker who had been born into slavery but now led one of Charleston's largest black congregations. Reverend Morris prayed over the boy, anointed his forehead with oil, and declared that John was being tested by the Lord for some greater purpose. But even as the Reverend spoke words of faith and comfort, John could feel something else at work, something that had little to do with the Christian God and everything to do with forces that predated any church. It was an old woman named Delphine LeBlanc who finally spoke the truth that everyone else was too frightened or too civilized to acknowledge. Delphine was a root worker, a practitioner of the African spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery, evolving into something uniquely American yet still connected to ancient knowledge. She lived on the outskirts of the black neighborhood in a cabin that most people avoided after dark. Sarah had resisted going to Delphine for weeks, knowing that seeking such help would brand her as backward, as someone who clung to the superstitions that educated, respectable free people were supposed to abandon. But when John began to speak in his sleep, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, a deep male voice that sometimes used words in a language Sarah didn't recognize, she swallowed her pride and made the journey to Delphine's cabin. The old woman took one look at John and nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "This child got one foot in this world and one foot in the next," Delphine said, her accent thick with the Gullah influences of the Sea Islands. "That man who comes in his dreams, his blood father, he ain't resting easy. He got unfinished business, and is calling to his son to help him finish it." Sarah felt ice water flood her veins. "What kind of business?" Delphine shook her head. "The dead don't always speak clear, child. But I can tell you this. That boy of yours is marked. Them blue eyes ain't just from his daddy's blood. They a sign. It can see between the worlds, walk paths that are close to most folks. And something on the other side wants him to walk them paths soon. How do I stop it?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "You don't," Delphine replied simply. "You can't stop what's written in a person's bones. All you can do is prepare him for what's coming." Over the following weeks, Delphine worked with John, teaching him techniques passed down through generations, ways to protect himself spiritually, how to distinguish between helpful spirits and malevolent ones, methods for grounding himself in the physical world when the pull of the other side grew too strong. Sarah watched these sessions with a growing sense of dread, understanding that she was losing her son to forces beyond her comprehension or control. And then, in the bitter January of 1877, everything changed. The sickness came on suddenly. One morning, John woke with a fever so intense that his skin felt like fire to the touch. Dr. Webb was summoned immediately, and he diagnosed pneumonia, a common enough killer in Charleston's damp winters, especially among the poor who couldn't afford adequate heating fuel. For 3 days, Sarah barely left her son's bedside. She bathed him with cool water, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and prayed with a desperation that bordered on madness. The fever broke on the 4th day, and for a brief, shining moment, she thought he would recover. But on the 5th day, something changed. John's breathing grew shallow and labored. His eyes, those extraordinary blue eyes, took on a glassy, distant quality, as if he was looking at something far beyond the walls of their small house. Dr. Webb returned and listened to John's lungs with his stethoscope, his expression growing grave. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said quietly. "The infection has spread. There is nothing more I can do. You should prepare yourself." Sarah refused to accept it. She sent for Reverend Morris, who came and read scripture over the dying boy. She sent for Delphine, who burned herbs and chanted in languages that made the Reverend uncomfortable enough to leave. But none of it mattered. On January 22, 1877, as the afternoon sun slanted through the window of their small house, John Mercer took his last breath. He was 11 years old. Sarah's scream could be heard throughout the neighborhood. It was a sound of pure, primal anguish, the cry of a mother whose world had just ended. Women from neighboring houses came running, and they found Sarah collapsed over her son's body, weeping with such violence that they feared for her sanity. Dr. Webb returned to officially pronounce the death and fill out the necessary documents. He noted the time, 4:17 de la tarde. He closed John's eyes, those remarkable blue eyes, with his own hands and pulled the sheet up over the boy's face. The funeral was held 3 days later at the Emmanuel AME Church. Nearly 200 people attended, filling the pews and spilling out onto the street. They came to mourn not just the death of one child, but the loss of potential, the cutting short of a bright young life in a community that had already suffered more than its share of grief. John's body lay in a simple pine coffin at the front of the church. Several people would later testify that they had seen him there, had looked upon his peaceful face one final time before the lid was closed. Among them was Silas Porter, the night watchman, who had known John slightly and had volunteered to help carry the small coffin to its final resting place. The burial took place in the cemetery behind the church, in a plot that Sarah had purchased with the last of her savings. Reverend Morris spoke words of comfort, assuring the mourners that young John was now in the arms of Jesus, free from pain and suffering. As the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground, Sarah collapsed again, held upright only by the women on either side of her. Silas Porter was one of 4 men who shoveled earth onto the coffin. It would remember years later the sound the dirt made as it hit the pine wood, a hollow, final sound that seemed to echo with terrible finality. He helped pack the earth down firmly, then assisted in placing a simple wooden marker at the head of the grave. It read simply, John Mercer, 1865 to 1877. Gone to glory. For 3 weeks, that grave remained undisturbed. Sarah visited it daily, kneeling in the frozen earth and speaking to her son as if he could still hear her. Other mourners came too, leaving small tokens, wildflowers when they could find them, smooth stones, once a small wooden toy horse that John had admired in life. The grave looked like any other grave. The earth remained settled and compact. There was no indication that anything unusual was occurring beneath the surface. But on the night of February 13th, something changed. A few minutes past midnight, a young couple taking a shortcut through the cemetery claimed they heard sounds coming from the direction of the newer graves, a scratching, scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. They hurried past, convincing themselves it was just rats or some other animal disturbed by their passage. The next morning, an elderly man who came to tend his wife's grave noticed that the earth on John Mercer's burial site looked disturbed, as if something had shifted beneath it. He mentioned it to Reverend Morris, who investigated and decided it was probably just the freeze-thaw cycles causing the soil to shift. He had seen it before. That evening, February 14th, Silas Porter began his nightly rounds of the cemetery. It was his job to ensure that no vandals disturbed the graves, a necessary precaution in a city still torn by the hatreds of war and Reconstruction. He carried a lantern and a heavy walking stick, and he knew every corner of St. Michael's cemetery by heart. At precisely midnight, he would remember the exact moment because the church bells were ringing. He saw movement near the newer section of the graveyard. Assuming it was a stray dog or perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter, he raised his lantern and called out a warning. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. A boy was standing beside an open grave. The grave Silas himself had helped fill just 3 weeks earlier. The boy was covered in dirt, his clothes torn and muddy. But it was his eyes that captured Silas' attention and held it with an almost hypnotic power. They glowed with an eerie blue light in the lantern's illumination. And they were fixed on Silas with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. John, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. John Mercer. The boy took a step forward, and Silas' lantern fell from his nerveless fingers. The glass shattered, but Silas barely noticed. He was staring at the impossible, at a violation of every natural law he had ever known. The boy opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, only a dry, rasping sound, like wind whistling through a hollow tree. Then he turned and began walking toward the cemetery gates with slow, deliberate steps. Silas found his voice and his legs at the same moment. It ran, not toward the boy, but toward the church, toward people, toward sanity. He pounded on the door of Reverend Maurice's house, which stood adjacent to the church, shouting incoherently about the dead rising in Judgment Day. Reverend Morris, roused from sleep, tried to calm Silas down, but the night watchman was nearly hysterical. Finally, the Reverend agreed to go to the cemetery and see for himself. He brought 2 other men with him, members of the church who lived nearby and had been awakened by Silas shouting. What they found made all 4 men question their sanity. John Mercer's grave had been opened from the inside. The earth was scattered around the site, and the wooden marker had been pushed aside. When they worked up the courage to look into the grave itself, they found the coffin with its lid broken open, though it splintered outward as if something had burst through it from within. The coffin was empty. More disturbing still, there were scratch marks on the underside of the coffin lid, deep gouges that could only have been made by human fingernails. And there was blood, dried and brown, on the splintered wood. Reverend Morris stood at the edge of the violated grave, his mind struggling to make sense of what his eyes were showing him. This was impossible. He had presided over John's funeral himself. He had seen the boy's body, cold and still. He had watched the coffin being lowered into the earth and covered with 6 feet of soil and clay. We need to find Sarah Mercer, he said finally, his voice shaking. We need to tell her. God help us, I don't know what we need to tell her. But Sarah already knew. She had been awakened from a fitful sleep by a sound, a soft knocking at her door, so gentle it might have been mistaken for a branch brushing against the wood. But there were no trees close enough to her house for that to be possible. She had lain in bed for a moment, heart pounding, telling herself it was her imagination, a dream bleeding into waking. Then the knocking came again, slightly more insistent. Sarah rose from bed and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch. Some part of her knew what she would find on the other side, had perhaps known it from the moment John died, from the moment he had first started dreaming of his father's ghost. She opened the door. Jon stood on her porch, illuminated by the pale moonlight. It was covered in grave dirt, his clothes torn and filthy. His skin had the waxy, unnatural pallor of death. But his eyes, those incredible blue eyes that he had inherited from a father they never known, were alive and aware and fixed on her face with desperate need. "Mama," he whispered, and his voice was like wine through autumn leaves, dry and rustling and not quite human. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't faint or cry out or run away in terror. Instead, she did what any mother would do. She reached out and pulled her son into her arms. "Dirt and death and impossibility be damned. I beg of you, baby," she murmured, holding him tight as he shuddered against her. "I beg of you. You're home now." But even as she spoke those words of comfort, Sarah understood with terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. Her son had crossed a threshold that should not be crossed. He had returned from a place where no one should be able to return. And the world, both the living world and the world beyond, would not let such a transgression go unanswered. What David had brought John back from the dead had done so for a reason. And Sarah knew, with a mother's intuition and a Ruth Borker's understanding, that the price for such a miracle would be higher than she could possibly imagine. In the cemetery, Reverend Morris and his companions stood around the empty grave as dawn began to break over Charleston. They had no answers, no explanations that could reconcile what they were seeing with everything they believed about life, death, and the immutable laws of nature. "What do we do?" one of the men asked, his voice shaking. Reverend Morris looked at the violated grave, at the broken coffin, at the scratch marks that testified to unthinkable suffering. He thought of his theology, his training, his certainty that he understood how the world worked. All of it seemed to crumble to dust in the face of this impossible evidence. "We pray," he said finally. "We pray for guidance, and we pray for protection. Because if John Mercer has come back from the dead, if the Lord has allowed such a thing to happen, then there is a purpose to it that we cannot yet comprehend. And God help us all when that purpose is revealed." The men bowed their heads in prayer as the sun rose over Charleston, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed prophetic in their intensity, like blood and fire, like judgment and transformation, like the dawn of something unprecedented in a city that had already witnessed more than its share of the impossible. In her small house on Archdale Street, Sarah Mercer held her son and rocked him gently, as she had when he was an infant. Jon clung to her, his two cold hands gripping her nightdress, his face buried against her shoulder. He smelled of earth and decay and something else, something that made Sarah's nose wrinkle, a sweet, cloying scent that reminded her of jasmine blooming over a grave. "What happened, baby?" she whispered. "Where did you go?" Jon pulled back slightly and looked up at her with those luminous blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice was clearer now, more like the child she remembered. But underneath it, she could hear something else, an echo, perhaps, or a harmony, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "I went to find him, Mama," John said. "I went to find my father. He showed me the way back. He showed me how to open the door." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "What door, sweetheart? What door did you open?" John's eyes grew distant, as if he was looking at something she couldn't see, something that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "The door between the living and the dead," he said simply. "The door that's supposed to stay closed. But Mama, it's not closed anymore. He opened it. And now things can come through. Things that were trapped on the other side. He didn't know. He didn't understand what I was doing." A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "What things, John? What's coming through?" But before her son could answer, a sound echoed through the pre-dawn stillness, a sound that would become terrifyingly familiar in the days and weeks to come. It was a howling, inhuman and filled with rage and hunger, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond her small house. And in the growing light of that February morning, As word began to spread through Charleston that John Mercer had returned from the grave, neither mother nor son could know that they had just unleashed something that would test the very foundations of faith, reason, and reality itself. The boy who came back from the dead had opened a door that should have remained forever closed. And through that door, darkness was pouring into the world like water through a broken dam, bringing with it horrors that would make even the nightmares of war seem pale and distant by comparison. This was only the beginning of the impossible. The true horror was yet to come. The news of John Mercer's return spread through Charleston's black community like wildfire through dry timber. By mid-morning on February 15th, a crowd had gathered outside Sarah's small house on Archdale Street, drawn by a mixture of curiosity, fear, and desperate hope. If one child could return from death, perhaps others could, though. Perhaps the mothers who had lost sons to disease, to violence, to the countless dangers that stalked the poor and vulnerable might see their children again. But there was also darker speculation. In hushed voices, people whispered about evil spirits, about demons taking human form, about divine punishment for unnamed sins. The more educated dismissed such talk as superstition, but even they couldn't explain what Silas Porter and Reverend Morris had witnessed in the cemetery. Sarah kept her door locked and her curtains drawn. In city, she tended to John with the careful attention she might give to a fever patient, though the malady afflicting her son defied any medical understanding. It was cold to the touch, his skin maintaining an unnatural chill despite the blanket she wrapped around him and the fire she kept burning in the small hearth. His breathing was shallow and irregular, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time before resuming with a shuddering gasp that made Sarah's heart lurch. Most disturbing were his eyes. Those remarkable blue eyes now seemed to glow with their own internal light, especially in darkness. When John looked at her, Sarah had the unsettling sensation that her son was seeing through her, past her, into dimensions and distances that mortal vision should not penetrate. "Tell me everything," she said on that first morning, sitting beside him on his narrow bed. "Tell me what happened after you. After you died." John's gaze grew distant, unfocused. When he spoke, his voice carried that strange harmonic quality that made it sound as though multiple people were speaking at once. "I remember the fever," he began slowly. "I remember burning, feeling like my body was on fire from the inside. And then there was pain, terrible pain in my chest, like something was squeezing my lungs. I couldn't breathe, Mama. I tried so hard, but I couldn't pull any air into my body." Sarah gripped his cold hand, tears streaming silently down her face. And then, suddenly the pain stopped. Everything stopped. He was floating above my bed, and I could see you below me, crying and holding my body. I tried to tell you I was alright, that I didn't hurt anymore, but you couldn't hear me. Nobody could hear me. It paused, his luminous eyes reflecting the firelight in strange ways. There was a pull, like a current in a river. It was drawing me away from my body, away from you, away from everything I knew. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't resist it. The pull got stronger and stronger, and then everything went dark. John shuddered, and Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around him. When the darkness cleared, I was in a place that wasn't a place. It was gray and foggy, and I could hear voices all around me, thousands of voices, maybe millions, all talking at once. Some were crying, some were screaming, some were just empty, making sounds that didn't take quite words. "Where were you, baby?" "I don't know, Mama." Delpine called it the threshold. "Remember? The space between worlds. I think that's where I was. And I wasn't alone. There were others there, people who looked as confused as I felt. So many of them had been there a long time. I could tell because they were starting to fade, becoming see-through like smoke." John's grip on Sarah's hand tightened, his supernatural strength making her wince. "I was so scared. I called out for you, for anyone who could help me. And that's when he appeared. My father. Thomas Whitmore." Sarah's breath caught. "You saw him? You saw Thomas?" "Yes. It looked just like in my dreams, but more real, more solid than anything else in that great place. He came to me and he said, 'John, you shouldn't be here. Not yet. You're being called too early.' He asked him what he meant, and he told me that I had a purpose, something I was supposed to do in the world of the living. He said the door had opened too soon, before I was ready, before I understood what I was meant to be." "What door?" John's eyes met hers, and Sarah saw terrible knowledge reflected in their blue depths. "The door between life and death. Mama, he said it's always been there, locked and sealed, keeping the dead in their realm and the living in theirs. But something broke the seal. Something cracked it open just enough for spirits to slip through. And because of my blood, because I'm caught between two worlds, black and white, living and dead, I could see the door. He could feel it calling to me even before I died. He fell silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts, or perhaps gathering the courage to continue. My father said he could send me back. He said he knew the way, knew the paths that led from death back to life. But he warned me that coming back would change me, would make me something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. He said I would be a bridge, a doorway myself. And he said that once I crossed back over, other things might follow. Sarah felt as forming in her stomach. What other things? The angry ones. The ones who died violently, who died too soon, who have unfinished business in the world of the living. My father said they would sense the opening I created and try to push through behind me. He said I would have to learn to control it, to close the door when it needed to be closed and open it when it needed to be opened. But you're just a child, Sarah whispered. How can you be expected to do such things? John's smile was sad and far too old for his young face. I'm not really a child anymore, Mama. You don't think I ever will be again. Something happened when I crossed back over. I brought knowledge with me, understanding that don't belong in the mind of an 11-year-old boy. He can see things now, know things, and it scares me. Before Sarah could respond, a loud knock echoed through the house. A voice called out, Sarah Mercer, this is Dr. Webb. Please, I need to examine the boy. People are afraid, and we need to understand what's happening. Sarah looked at John, who nodded slowly. Together, they went to the door. Dr. Marcus Webb stood on the porch, his medical bag in hand. Behind him, Sarah could see at least 30 people gathered in the street, watching with a mixture of hope and fear. The doctor's face was pale, his eyes showing the strain of a sleepless night. May I come in? He asked quietly. Sarah stepped aside, and Dr. Webb entered the small house. When his eyes fell on John, he stopped abruptly, his professional composure cracking. Dear God, he breathed. It's true. Jure really. How is this possible? I don't know, Doctor, Sarah said. But he's here, and he needs help. Dr. Webb approached John cautiously, as one might approach a wild animal. He sat down his bag and pulled out his stethoscope with trembling hands. May I examine you, John? The boy nodded and sat still while the doctor listened to his chest. What Dr. Webb heard, or rather, didn't they hear, made him go even paler. He checked again, moving the stethoscope to different positions, pressing harder against John's chest. This is impossible, he muttered. Your heart, it's barely beating. Once, maybe twice per minute, if that. No human being could survive with such a limited circulation. And your lungs, you're hardly breathing at all. By all medical understanding, you should be dead. I was dead, John said simply. Maybe I still am, in a way. Dr. Webb examined John's eyes, his reflexes, his skin temperature. Every test revealed anomalies that defied medical explanation. The boy's body temperature was at least 20 degrees below normal. His pupils responded to light, but with an unnatural slowness. When the doctor pricked John's finger to test his blood, what emerged was darker than normal blood, almost black, and it didn't declot properly. I need to report this, Dr. Webb said, backing away from John as if proximity to the impossible might somehow contaminate him. The medical authorities need to know. This could change everything we understand about life and death. No, Sarah said firmly. You can't. Do you know what they'll do? They take him away, put him in some laboratory or asylum. They'll treat him like an animal, a curiosity to be studied and displayed. He won't let that happen to my son. Dr. Webb looked torn, his scientific curiosity warring with his humanity. Finally, he nodded. For now, he say nothing. But Sarah, you need to understand, what's happened here is beyond anything eBay ever encountered. John he isn't fully alive in the way we understand life. And if word spreads, which it will, you won't be able to protect him from those who want to study him or those who want to destroy him out of fear. The doctor's words proved prophetic. By the next morning, the story had spread beyond Charleston's black community and reached the white parts of the city. Newspapers picked up the tale, with the Charleston Mercury running a sensational headline, Negro boy returns from grave. Witnesses claim miracle or devilry in cemetery resurrection. The article was a mixture of fact, speculation, and barely concealed racism. It questioned whether John's return was a divine miracle or some form of voodoo witchcraft, playing into white fears about African spiritual practices. It suggested that the entire incident might be an elaborate hoax, with the implication that black people were either gullible enough to believe such nonsense or dishonest enough to perpetrate it. The reaction was swift and varied. So many white citizens dismissed the entire story as superstitious fantasy. Others saw it as evidence of dark practices among the freed slave population and called for investigations. A small but vocal group of religious extremists declared it a sign of the end times, proof that the apocalypse was imminent. But it was the scientific community that took the most aggressive interest. By February 17th, 3 days after Jones' return, a delegation arrived from the Medical College of South Carolina. They demanded to examine John, insisting that the advancement of medical knowledge required investigation of such an unprecedented case. Sarah refused to let them in. She stood at her door, blocking their entry with her body and her will. "My son is not a specimen for your experiments," she told them, her voice steady despite her fear. "Is a child who's been through trauma. You will not touch him." The doctors argued. They threatened. They offered money. Finally, they left with promises, or threats, that